The message arrived while I was eating breakfast. That is the part nobody talks about when they retell this story. They talk about the fleet. They talk about the gate. They talk about what came after. But nobody mentions that the most important diplomatic communication in human history was delivered on an ordinary Tuesday morning, while Admiral Claire Vasquez was eating instant oatmeal with too much brown sugar and not enough coffee. I was sitting at my desk on the UES Rubicon, 47 million kilometers from Earth, reading a damage report from our port thruster array, when my communications officer knocked once and came in without waiting. Lieutenant Owen Drake never knocked without waiting, unless something had already gone wrong. He placed a data tablet on my desk without saying a word. I looked at the header. The transmission originated from a Vethrani relay station at the edge of human space. Vethrani signals were not unusual. We traded with Vethrani merchants regularly, and the Empire maintained 3 formal embassies inside our territory. But this signal had not come through any embassy channel. It had come through every channel simultaneously. Every human communications array in 14 star systems received it at the exact same moment. That had never happened before. I read it once quickly, then put down my spoon and read it again slowly. The Galactic Hegemony, speaking through its Supreme Council in the voice of 47 signatory species, was giving humanity 30 galactic days to surrender all wormhole gate technology in its possession, not lease it, not share access to it, surrender it, permanently and completely, with full documentation of every modification humanity had made to gate systems since first contact. The consequences for non-compliance were described as corrective pacification. I had to look that phrase up. It took me 4 minutes to find a proper translation from the original Vethrani diplomatic script, because the version released to the public had been softened considerably. The actual Vethrani phrase, rendered as accurately as language permitted, meant something closer to enforced biological cessation of the offending civilization's capacity for further development. The public translation said corrective pacification. I sat with that for a long time. Outside my viewport, the stars were completely indifferent. Owen was still standing at the door. He was 26 years old, from a city called Galway on the western coast of Ireland, and he had a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was nervous. He was doing it now, which meant he had already read the transmission and understood what it said. "Who else has seen this?" I asked. "Everyone," he said. "It went public the moment it arrived. There was no filtering window. The hegemony sent it directly to civilian networks, not just military ones." I thought about that. That was intentional. The hegemony did not want this message to be held in a commander's office for 3 days, while the military drafted a measured response. They wanted every human being alive to read it at the same time. They wanted the panic to be immediate and simultaneous. Either that, or they wanted something else. Something that felt like panic, but was actually something more complicated. I asked Owen to leave me alone for an hour, which he did without argument, and I spent that hour reading the full hegemony transmission in its original form, rather than the translated version. My Vethrani was not perfect, but it was good enough to catch the things the translation had smoothed over. The smoothed over things were what kept me awake that night. The public translation read like a demand. The original Vethrani read like a warning from someone who was personally frightened. There was a grammatical construction in the Vethrani language that indicated the speaker was reporting a danger they themselves feared, rather than issuing a threat they controlled. It appeared 7 times in the original transmission. It appeared 0 times in the human translation. Those 7 instances changed the meaning of the entire document. The hegemony was not saying we will destroy you if you do not comply. They were saying something like, you do not understand what you are holding, and neither did we, once. And we are asking you, please, to let it go, before something happens that cannot be undone. I wrote that down in my personal log and then I encrypted it with a key that only I had. Because if I was right, this was either the most important thing I had figured out in 20 years of military service, or I was completely wrong, and the oatmeal had been bad. I did not sleep well that night. The next morning, Earth voted. Not immediately, of course. There were 3 weeks of the loudest political noise humanity had produced since we started reaching into space. The debate spread across every platform, every channel, every kitchen table and school cafeteria, on 14 worlds. It was genuinely impossible to find a quiet corner of human civilization that was not loudly processing its feelings about what the hegemony had said. Some people were frightened, some were outraged. A large and surprisingly vocal group found the whole thing very funny. The term corrective pacification became a joke almost immediately. Within 48 hours of the transmission, there were songs, images, short video clips, and a bewildering number of products, all playing on the phrase, in ways that ranged from clever to completely baffling. I saw a coffee mug that said I survived corrective pacification, and all I got was this mug being sold by a company in New Zealand. It sold 600,000 units in a week. I kept reading the original transmission. The part that most of the public commentary missed entirely was Section 11, which was buried deep enough in the document that most people who were reading the translated version had already stopped paying close attention by the time they got there. Section 11 contained a list of 7 other civilizations, identified by hegemony registry numbers rather than their actual names, who had, in previous galactic eras, made modifications to gate technology without authorization from the Hegemony Council. The list did not say what had happened to those civilizations. It did not need to. The registry numbers were searchable in the public Hegemony Archive database, which humanity had been given access to as part of our initial contact agreement. I spent 2 days searching each of those 7 registry numbers. 3 of them returned no results at all, which in the Hegemony Archive system meant the record had been sealed. 2 returned records that had been partially redacted, with large sections replaced by a Vethrani phrase that translated roughly as, "Information withheld pending council review." The remaining 2 returned records that were complete, and those complete records described 2 civilizations that had developed gate technology independently, and had then, according to the hegemony's own records, simply stopped being detectable. Not destroyed, not conquered, not relocated, stopped being detectable. That was the phrase the Hegemony Archive used. Their signals stopped being received. Their territory, when surveyed by hegemony vessels, was found to be physically intact. Their planets were there. Their structures were there. Their equipment was there. They were not. I encrypted that finding in the same file as my translation notes, and then I went and stood at my viewport for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. Colonel Nate Calloway found me there about an hour later. Nate was my second-in-command on the Rubicon, a broad-shouldered man from the state of Montana who had been in space longer than I had and had opinions about nearly everything. He was one of the 3 people on the ship I trusted without qualification. He stood next to me at the viewport and looked at nothing for a moment too. "Earth Command wants you on a briefing call in 40 minutes, he said. "I know. You look like you found something." "I found something. Good or bad?" I thought about that. "I'm not sure the words good and bad apply to what I found," I said. "I think the words might be significant and urgent." He nodded. Nate was good at accepting information at face value, without pushing too hard. That was one of the things I valued about him. "The Senate vote is tomorrow," he said. "Early projections say it's going to be 9-5 against compliance." "That seems about right. You're not surprised?" "Nate," I said, "we are a species that responded to the most serious diplomatic ultimatum in our history, by making coffee mugs. No, I am not surprised." He actually smiled at that, which was rare enough to notice. I went to my briefing call. I presented what I had found to a room full of generals, admirals, and 3 civilian officials, who looked like they had not slept in a week. I told them about the grammatical construction in the original Vethrani. I told them about the 7 civilizations in Section 11. I told them about the 2 whose records were complete, and what those records said. The room was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then General Philip Okafor, who commanded Earth's Outer Defense Network and was the most senior military officer I reported to, leaned forward in his seat and said, "Admiral Vasquez, in your professional judgment, does any of what you have just told us change the strategic calculus?" I thought about that carefully before I answered, because Philip Okafor was not a man who appreciated imprecision. "Sir," I said, "in my professional judgment, what I have just told you changes every single thing we thought we understood about the nature of this situation. Whether it changes the strategic response depends on information I do not currently have access to." "What information would that be?" "I would want to know what those 7 civilizations were doing with gate technology that the hegemony considered dangerous enough to include in a final warning. The hegemony clearly knows something about gates that they did not include in this transmission. The question I cannot answer yet is whether they know that thing because they figured it out themselves, or because something showed them. Another long silence. A woman named Deputy Director Laura Finch, who ran Earth's Civilian Intelligence Coordination Office and had the most carefully neutral facial expression I had ever seen on a human face, said, "Are you suggesting the hegemony is frightened of something that is not us?" "I am suggesting," I said, "that the hegemony's ultimatum reads differently in its original language than it reads in translation, and that the difference is consistent with an organization that is trying to prevent a specific outcome rather than establish dominance over a weaker party." Laura Finch looked at me for 5 seconds without expression. Then she wrote something down on the physical notepad she always carried, which meant she considered it important enough that she did not want it on any digital record. I noticed that. I filed it. The Senate voted the following afternoon, 9-5 against compliance, which matched the projections exactly. The public response to the vote was overwhelming positive. There were celebrations on Earth, on Mars, on the 3 major colony worlds. People were proud. People were relieved. People were energized by the idea of their civilization standing firm against an ultimatum from a much larger power. I watched the celebration feeds from my office on the Rubicon and felt something I did not have a clean word for. It was not fear, exactly. It was the particular feeling of knowing something that the celebrating people did not know, and being unable to decide whether telling them would help or only make things worse. Owen brought me fresh coffee without being asked, which meant he had read my face correctly. "The deadline is 30 galactic days," he said. "That's 31.5 standard days, so we have time." "We have 31.5 standard days," I agreed. "The question is what we do with them." Earth Command is already drafting a formal response to the hegemony, rejecting the ultimatum. I know. And Stratcom is repositioning several fleet elements toward the outer gate positions, as a precautionary measure. I know that too. Owen hesitated. He was a careful young man who thought before he spoke, which was why I had kept him as my communications officer for 3 years despite several offers of promotion that would have taken him elsewhere. "Admiral," he said, "is there something specific you're worried about that you haven't said in a briefing yet?" I looked at my coffee. It was better than the oatmeal had been, which was not a particularly high standard. "Owen," I said, "when the hegemony sent this transmission through civilian networks instead of military ones, what was the first thing you thought?" He considered that. "I thought they wanted maximum exposure. Panic response." "What was the second thing you thought?" He was quiet for longer this time. "I thought it was strange that they gave us 30 days. If they could enforce this ultimatum militarily, 30 days is a lot of time to let us prepare a defense." "And what did that make you think? That they weren't planning to enforce it militarily? Or," I said, "that they were hoping, very much, that they would not have to?" He stood with that for a moment. "The celebrations outside seem very loud," he said finally. "They always are," I said, "right before things get complicated." The 31 days passed faster than I would have liked. Earth Command sent its formal rejection on day 3. The hegemony acknowledged receipt and said nothing further, which created a 10-day window of silence that the political commentators filled with increasingly confident predictions that the hegemony had blinked, that the ultimatum was empty, that humanity had called their bluff and won. I spent those 10 days reading everything I could find about gate technology that was not classified above my clearance level, and making informal inquiries about the things that were. I had enough seniority and enough goodwill in the right places to get answers to some of those inquiries. Not all of them, but some. What I learned in those 10 days I kept entirely in the encrypted file, because what I learned in those 10 days changed the second thing I thought about, the thing that lived underneath the strategic calculus, and the Vithrani grammar, and the 7 civilizations that had stopped being detectable. What I learned in those 10 days made me think that the hegemony might not be the most dangerous thing in this situation. On day 31, the deadline passed. Nothing happened. On Earth and across the 14 colonies, there was another celebration, larger than the first one, more confident. The coffee mugs sold another 1,000,000 units. The songs got louder. Public confidence in the Senate's decision went up by 23% in a single polling cycle. I did not celebrate. On day 37, 6 days after the deadline, Owen knocked on my door once and came in without waiting. He put a data tablet on my desk. I looked at the header. Long-range sensor relay from the Kepler 442 monitoring buoy, at the edge of the wormhole gate network, at the absolute outer boundary of human space. The Soul Gate, which was humanity's primary wormhole terminus, the largest gate in our network, the gate through which 90% of our interstellar traffic moved every single day, had just registered an incoming transit request from the other side. One ship. The ID signature was Hegemony Military. I put down my coffee and looked at Owen. "Get Nate," I said. "Get everyone. And Owen, start waking up Earth Command. Tell them we have contact." He was already moving before I finished the sentence. I stood up from my desk and walked to the bridge. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same as they had always been. Distant, indifferent, patient in the way that only very old things can be patient. But something on the other side of our gate was about to come through, and the celebrations that were still running on 14 worlds had not yet received the news. I had 37 minutes before that transit completed. I used them to think about the 7 civilizations that had stopped being detectable, and the grammatical construction that meant the speaker was frightened of something, and the thing Laura Finch had written down on her physical notepad that she did not want on any digital record. Then the Rubicon's alert klaxon started, and thinking time was over. The Hegemony ship came through the Sol Gate at exactly the speed of something that does not expect to be fired upon. I noticed that, before I noticed anything else about it. In my experience, the speed at which a vessel transitions through a wormhole gate tells you more about its intentions than anything the crew might say afterward. Hostile transits are fast and low. Diplomatic transits are slow and visible. Recon transits are somewhere in the middle, which is the most dangerous category because it means whoever sent the ship has not decided yet. This ship came through slow and visible, and broadcasting its identification codes on every open channel simultaneously, which meant it wanted to be seen and recognized, and not misidentified as a threat in the first confused seconds of a tense situation. I took that as a good sign for about 90 seconds. Then the long-range sensors finished resolving its profile, and I understood why it had come through so slowly. It was not being cautious. It was being deliberate. It was a single Hegemony military vessel, a class of ship I had seen in intelligence files but never in person, and it was approximately 8 times the size of the largest human warship currently in service. It dwarfed the Rubicon, the way a cathedral dwarfs a garden shed. It moved with the unhurried confidence of something that could not reasonably be threatened by anything in the immediate area. The bridge of the Rubicon had filled up in the time it took me to walk from my office. Nate was at the tactical station. Owen was at communications. My navigation officer, Lieutenant Commander Frances Aldridge, had her hands moving across her console in the quick, precise way that meant she was running calculations she had not been asked to run, because Frances always stayed 3 steps ahead of the situation, whether or not anyone told her to. I appreciated that about her. I sat in the command chair and looked at the main display. The Hegemony ship had stopped at what I privately thought of as the courtesy distance, far enough from our own fleet position to not be interpreted as aggressive, close enough to make absolutely certain we could see exactly how large it was. "Communications," I said. "Channel open," Owen said. "They're already transmitting." The voice that came through was translated by our onboard systems in real time, which meant it was slightly flat and slightly delayed, which was always slightly eerie, regardless of how many times I heard it. The Hegemony officer identified himself as Fleet Commander Sorvax, of the Vethrani Directorate, speaking on behalf of the Supreme Council. His message was 6 words long. It was, "Last offer, surrender, 1 hour." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of the Rubicon's bridge for a moment, not because I was finding the answer up there, but because the ceiling was the only part of the bridge that did not currently have a worried face on it, and I needed a second without worried faces. 1 hour. Not 30 days. Not a negotiating window. 1 hour. I looked at Nate. Nate looked at me. He had the particular expression he always had when a situation had moved well past the point where any plan he had prepared was useful, which was the expression of a man who had decided to simply be very competent at whatever the next 60 seconds required. "What's Earth Command saying?" I asked. Earth Command is asking you to acknowledge the transmission and buy time, Owen said. How much time are they asking me to buy? Owen hesitated for a fraction of a second. As much as possible, Admiral. As much as possible. That was the language Earth Command used when they did not have a plan yet and needed space to find one. I had heard it before. I had never heard it in a situation quite like this one, where the other party had given us 60 minutes and shown up in a ship that made our entire forward fleet look like a polite suggestion. Transmit a formal acknowledgement, I said. Tell Commander Sorvax that we have received his message, that we are relaying it to the appropriate authorities, and that we will respond within the stated time frame. That was true enough to not be a lie, and bought us nothing, which was the honest situation. I used the next 40 minutes to think, and to read every report my tactical and intelligence officers could pull together on the single hegemony ship currently sitting at the courtesy distance from our gate. The reports were not encouraging, not because they contained alarming information, but because they contained almost no information at all. Hegemony warships of this class were not well documented in our intelligence files because, until approximately 37 minutes ago, none of them had ever come close enough to human space for us to observe in any detail. What we knew was general. What we did not know was specific. And in a military situation, the difference between general and specific is frequently the difference between a plan and a disaster. At minute 41, my long-range array officer, a quiet woman named Ensign Petra Hollis, who was 6 weeks out of the academy and had not yet developed the practiced calm that most experienced officers wore like a second uniform, said, Admiral, I'm getting something strange from the deep array. Define strange, I said. The soul gate is vibrating, she said. She looked at her screen like she wanted it to be wrong. Not from the hegemony ship. It's coming from the other side, inside the gate itself. The resonance pattern doesn't match any transit signature in my database. Nate was already at her station. He looked at the readings. He looked at me. That's not a transit signature, he said. No, I agreed. It's not. What is it? I had read enough about gate technology in the previous 31 days to have a theory, and my theory sat in my stomach like something cold and unpleasant. It's the gate responding to something, I said. Something on the other side that it can sense. What would a gate respond to? Frances asked from navigation, and her voice had the careful precision of someone who had already guessed the answer and was hoping she was wrong. I did not answer that immediately, because at that moment, the Soul Gate did something that it had never done in the 40 years since humanity first activated it. It expanded. Not by a small amount, not by an increment that could be measured in kilometers or even hundreds of kilometers. The gate, which was already the largest artificial structure in human space at nearly 400 kilometers across at its widest point, began to grow. The expansion was smooth and controlled, not chaotic, which was somehow worse than chaos would have been. Chaos would have meant an accident. This was deliberate. This was the gate doing something it had been designed, from the beginning, to be capable of, but which humanity had never witnessed, because we had never given it a reason. The final diameter, when it stopped expanding, was just over 11,000 kilometers. I know that number, because Petra read it off her screen in a voice so quiet I almost did not hear her, and then she said nothing else for the next 4 minutes, which was understandable. A gate 11,000 kilometers across is large enough to pass a small moon through without touching the edges. The hegemony ship, which had been sitting at the courtesy distance without moving, now moved. It glided to one side, with a grace that spoke of engines vastly more capable than anything it needed in this particular moment, and it turned to face the expanded gate directly. It was showing us something. It was pointing. Sorvax had not hailed us again. He did not need to. His message was 6 words and it had been delivered. Everything after that was demonstration. The first hegemony warship came through the expanded gate 14 seconds later. It was followed by another, and another, and another. And then there were no more individual vessels to count because they were coming through in formation, wing to wing, row behind row, a continuous flow of warships that filled the gate from edge to edge in blocks of 36 ships at a time, and the gate stayed open, and they kept coming. The Rubicon's automated tactical system, which was very good at its job, attempted to count and classify the incoming vessels. It managed to keep up for the first 90 seconds. After that, it gave up trying to count individual ships, and began expressing the incoming traffic as a rate per minute. I watched the number on that display climb. My crew was silent. The bridge of the Rubicon, which under normal circumstances had the ambient noise level of a busy office, was completely quiet, except for the hum of equipment and the very faint sound of Petra Hollis breathing in a controlled way that suggested she had been trained to regulate her breathing in high-stress situations and was currently using every bit of that training. Nate came and stood beside my command chair. He looked at the display for a long moment. 50 million, he said. The intelligence estimate before all this started was that the hegemony could field approximately 50 million combat-capable warships across its entire territory. Yes, I said. That's what's coming through. It appears that way. All of them. Through the same gate. He was quiet for a moment. They brought the whole thing. They brought the whole thing. I agreed. To make a point. To make a point. He nodded slowly, like a man absorbing information at a pace his mind insisted on regardless of urgency. That's a very large point. It is. The gate had been open for 6 hours, and the flow of ships had not slowed. Our sensor array, which had been upgraded twice in the last decade, and was considered one of the finest in the human military, could not find the back of the incoming formation. The display that had started counting individual vessels now showed a number so large it required scrolling to read in full. Earth Command had been on an open channel for the last 4 hours, but the voices on that channel had become progressively quieter as the hours passed, and at some point in the 5th hour the channel had gone briefly silent, before resuming with different voices. The different voices sounded calmer, which meant they were either actually calmer, or they were very good at pretending. My experience suggested the latter. They wanted me to acknowledge Sorvax's transmission again. I did. They wanted me to request an extension of the 1-hour deadline. I pointed out that the 1-hour deadline had passed approximately 3 hours ago, and the hegemony had not seemed to notice, or perhaps had simply decided that the demonstration they were currently running was more useful than any discussion of deadlines. They wanted me to ask if this was a show of force or an actual hostile action. I said, "It is both. It is a show of force precisely because it is not a hostile action. The hegemony is letting us count. They want us to understand the number." There was a long silence on the Earth Command channel. Then General Okafor's voice came through, and it had the texture of a man who had spent the last 6 hours moving between extreme positions very quickly, and had settled, at last, into a kind of difficult calm. "Admiral Vasquez," he said, "your assessment of the situation." I thought about how to say the true thing in the most useful way. "Sir," I said, 50 million warships have come through our primary gate and are currently holding position at a distance of approximately 800,000 kilometers from our gate perimeter. They are not advancing. They are not targeting. They are not jamming our communications. They are doing nothing except being exactly where they are, in exactly the number they are, and waiting for us to decide what that means." "And what does it mean?" "It means the hegemony is still talking," I said. "If this were an attack, we would know it. Ships in attack formation do not hold at 800,000 kilometers. Ships making a strategic point do." "And the strategic point is?" "The strategic point is that they have 50 million warships, and we have 14,000. And they brought all of theirs through the same gate at the same time, which is not militarily efficient, but is extremely clear as a message. The message is, we could end this if we chose to. We have not chosen to. Consider carefully." Another silence. "What do you recommend?" This was the question I had been preparing for, quietly, for 31 days, because I had believed, based on my reading of the original Vethrani transmission, and the 7 civilizations in Section 11, that if we reached this point, the recommendation that mattered most was not a military one. "Sir," I said, "I recommend we ask Commander Sorvax for a direct conversation, not a formal diplomatic channel, a direct conversation between his vessel and mine. I believe there is information the hegemony has that is not in any official communication we have received, and I believe they are willing to share it with the right person in the right setting, because I believe that sharing that information is actually why they are here." "You believe an armada of 50 million ships came to have a conversation?" "I believe an armada of 50 million ships came, because they could not think of any other way to make us take the conversation seriously. I said. And looking at the display in front of me right now, I cannot honestly say that they were wrong. Another long silence. This one lasted nearly 2 minutes. Then Okafor said, "Make contact." I nodded at Owen, who opened the channel. Commander Sorvax responded immediately, as if he had been expecting the call. His translated voice was flat and slightly delayed, but underneath the flattening I could hear something that the translation software had not been designed to carry. The particular quality of someone who has been waiting a very long time to have a specific conversation, and is relieved, against all expectation, that the conversation is finally beginning. He did not sound like a conqueror. He sounded like someone who was afraid they were too late. That sound, more than the 11,000-kilometer gate, or the 50 million ships, or the 6-word ultimatum, was the thing that made me sit forward in my chair and pay the most careful attention I was capable of paying. Because if Sorvax was afraid they were too late, the question that mattered was, too late for what? And I had a feeling, cold and specific and sitting right in the center of my chest, that I already knew the answer. I had known it, at some level, since the morning I read about the 7 civilizations that had stopped being detectable. I had just been hoping I was wrong. 6 years before the hegemony sent its ultimatum, before the coffee mugs and the Senate vote and the 50 million ships, I stood in a room that officially did not exist and listened to a man explain something that officially had not happened. His name was Director Calvin Marsh, and he was the civilian head of a program with no public name, no public budget, and no public staff. He was 71 years old, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of carrying classified information and smiling pleasantly at people who asked the wrong questions. He had very clear eyes and extremely dry hands, and he shook mine firmly when I walked into the briefing room and said, with complete sincerity, that he was glad I had agreed to come. I had not been asked if I agreed to come. I had been ordered to come, by General Okafor, with no explanation except a set of coordinates and a departure time. But Calvin Marsh seemed like the kind of person for whom the distinction between agreement and orders was more philosophical than practical, and I did not see any reason to correct him. The briefing room was buried inside a facility that did not appear on any public map, constructed inside a deep space maintenance platform in a stable orbit around Neptune. The platform was listed in Earth's official infrastructure registry as an automated fuel processing depot, which it also genuinely was, which was clever. The best cover stories are mostly true. There were 12 other people in the briefing room when I arrived. I recognized 3 of them from military and intelligence briefings. The other 9 I did not recognize at all, which was interesting. I had enough clearance and enough years of service to recognize most people who appeared at high-level classified briefings. The 9 I did not recognize were either from organizations above my clearance level, which was possible but unlikely, or from something else entirely, which was more interesting. Calvin Marsh asked everyone to sit down, and then he told us about Project Marathon. He did not start with what it was. He started with why. In 2297, he said, 8 years after first contact with the Vethrani, our scientific teams completed their analysis of the gate technology we had recovered from the Kepler-44 system. What they found was published in a classified report that reached approximately 60 people. I am going to tell you what was in that report. He paused. He looked around the room in a way that suggested he was not pausing for effect but actually taking a moment for himself, the way people do when they are about to say something they have said many times before but which still, somehow, feels strange to say. The gate at Kepler-44 was not built, he said. It grew. No one in the room spoke. The material composition of the gate structure is biological in origin, he continued. Not biological in the sense that it was assembled by living organisms using biological tools. Biological in the sense that the structure itself is, or was, or exists, in a state that our current scientific vocabulary does not have a precise word for. The structure is not alive in any way we would recognize. But it is not alive either. It is made of something that began as living matter, and was then transformed, over a very long period of time, into something that retains certain properties of living matter, while having shed others. He let that settle. The gate responds to certain types of electromagnetic signal, he said. Not radio signals, not the communications frequencies we were using when we first activated it. It responds to a very specific pattern of quantum resonance, that our teams took 4 years to isolate and identify. When exposed to that pattern, The gate does things it does not do otherwise. It expands. It changes its harmonic frequency. It reaches out, through the wormhole connection, and makes contact with other gates. A woman 2 seats to my left, one of the 9 I did not recognize, said, "Makes contact how?" "We are not certain," Calvin said, "but the effect is measurable. When we expose one gate to the resonance pattern, the gates at the other end of its wormhole connections show changes in their ambient output within approximately 11 minutes. We have replicated this 47 times. The 11-minute figure is consistent and appears to be a property of the gate network itself, not of the gate's individual response speed." "What does the hegemony know about this?" I asked. Calvin looked at me. "We believe the hegemony knows that the gates are biological in origin. We believe they discovered this before we did, given that they have been using gates for approximately 40,000 years, compared to our 40. We do not believe they know that the gates can communicate with each other, because we discovered that capability through a specific interaction that, as far as our intelligence indicates, the hegemony has never had reason to attempt." "What was the specific interaction?" I asked. "Our scientists were running a resonance test on the Kepler-44 gate," he said. "Standard experimental protocol at the time, testing for response to different frequencies. One of the scientists, a Dr. Amara Osei, was working on a completely unrelated personal project in her spare time. She was a mathematician. She had developed a particular sequence for modeling certain types of distributed network behavior. She ran that sequence as a signal pattern through the resonance apparatus, purely on a whim, to see what would happen." He paused again. "What happened," he said, "was that every gate in the hegemony network simultaneously entered a state that hegemony records, which we accessed later, describe as an anomalous resonance event. Every gate in their network, at exactly the same moment, for approximately 9 seconds, produced an output pattern that the hegemony could not explain and had never seen before. 9 seconds later, all of them returned to normal. The hegemony conducted an investigation that lasted several years and concluded, incorrectly, that the event was caused by an unusual alignment of deep space gravitational sources. He let us sit with that. Dr. Osei's mathematical sequence had, without her knowing it, essentially spoken to the gate network, he said, in a language the network recognized, and the network had answered. I thought about that for a moment. Then I thought about it again, from a different angle. You said this was 8 years after first contact, I said. That means you have had this information for 60 years. We have had this information for 60 years, Calvin confirmed. And in those 60 years, you built something. He smiled, and the smile was the smile of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right question. Admiral Vasquez, he said, we built many things. The tour of Project Marathon took 11 hours, and I did not sleep during any of them, because there was not a moment in those 11 hours when sleeping would have seemed like a reasonable use of the time. Marathon existed in fold space, which was the imprecise but serviceable term our scientists used for the region of space that existed between wormhole connections, the dimensional substrate through which gate travel was technically possible. It was not a place in the conventional sense. You could not point to it on a map. You could not navigate to it using conventional coordinates. You could only access it through a specific fold in the gravitational geometry near Neptune, which Dr. Osei had discovered as a consequence of her mathematical work with the gate network, and which was invisible to any sensor system that was not specifically calibrated to look for it. The hegemony's sensors were not calibrated to look for it. This was not an accident. Inside the fold, in a space that had no natural relationship to physical distance, Project Marathon had been under construction for 60 years. At any given moment, the construction employed between 40 and 70,000 people, all of whom lived and worked inside the fold, and communicated with the outside world through a relay system that added no detectable signal to the ambient electromagnetic noise of the Sol system. The primary product of those 60 years of construction was a fleet. Not a fleet like the fleets I had commanded, not a fleet arranged in the conventional understanding of warships and support vessels and supply lines. Marathon's fleet was built around a different concept, one that Dr. Osei and the generations of engineers and scientists who had followed her had developed from first principles over 6 decades. The idea that a gate was not a road, but a tool, and that if you understood how the tool worked at a fundamental level, you could use it in ways that no one who treated it like a road had ever imagined. The ships were not remarkable to look at. They were smaller than most hegemony warships, more angular, built with a certain deliberate simplicity that an observer might mistake for primitive design. The simplicity was intentional. Every unnecessary system had been stripped away to leave the maximum possible space for the one system that mattered, the gate resonance array, that occupied the entire central section of each ship. Each marathon ship could, using Dr. Osei's mathematical sequence and the biological language of the gate network, speak directly to any gate within range, not send a signal to a gate, speak to it, in something recognizable to the gate as language. And the gates, it turned out, were very good listeners. But what they would do with what they heard was something I did not fully understand until I sat with the chief engineer of Marathon, a woman named Dr. Grace Nakamura, who had spent 29 years inside the fold working on this question, and asked her directly. "When we speak to the gates," I said, "what are we asking them to do?" Grace Nakamura was 57 years old and had the manner of someone who had spent so long thinking about a single problem that other topics required conscious effort to engage with. She thought about my question for a moment, with the complete, focused attention she gave to everything.
"We are not asking them anything,"
she said.
"Gates do not respond to requests. They respond to instructions in their native language. It is less like talking to a person and more like knowing the right key for a lock."
"And what does the key unlock?" "Several things," she said. "Gate expansion is the most obvious. The gates can be expanded far beyond their standard operating parameters, which is what happens when the right sequence is transmitted. But the more significant capability is what we call gate exclusion, which is, a gate that receives a specific exclusion sequence will close to all transit, for a specified period, for any vessel that does not carry an authorized gate transponder, coded to our resonance frequency." She paused. "It is important to understand the scale of this. The gate network is not a series of individual structures that each need to be addressed separately. The network behaves as a single organism when the correct frequencies are used. An exclusion command sent through one gate propagates to every connected gate in the network within 11 minutes. I looked at her for a moment. "Every connected gate," I said, "including the hegemonies." "Every connected gate," she confirmed, "including the hegemonies." The silence that followed that statement had a particular quality. It was the silence of someone absorbing the actual magnitude of a thing they thought they understood, before they understood the actual magnitude. "If we sent an exclusion command," I said carefully, "what would happen to the hegemony fleet?" "Any hegemony vessels on the far side of their gates from their current position would be unable to transit back through," she said. "Their supply lines would be interrupted. Their communication relays, which route through the gate network for deep space transmission, would stop functioning. Their fleet elements, wherever they were in the galaxy at the moment the command was sent, would be isolated. And their gate-dependent infrastructure? Offline. The exclusion applies to transit attempts from vessels not carrying our authorized transponder. It does not physically damage the gates. But for any entity that relies on the gates for logistics, communication, or military coordination, the effect is functionally the same. I thought about 50 million warships coming through the Soul Gate. I thought about them coming through the same gate, all of them, in a single continuous stream. I thought about what it would mean to send an exclusion command after the last one had passed through and the gate had closed behind it. "They would be trapped," I said, "on our side. With no way home." Grace Nakamura nodded. "That is correct. And we have had this capability for how long?" She thought. "We have had the theoretical capability for approximately 20 years. The engineering took another 15 to make it reliable and scalable. We ran the first successful test of gate exclusion on a single unmanned gate buoy approximately 4 years ago. We have run 43 successful tests since then." I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, "Dr. Nakamura, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it as plainly and completely as you can." "Of course." "The hegemony's ultimatum is about gate technology. They want us to surrender all our gate technology and all our modifications. Is it possible they know about Marathon?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Marathon is completely invisible to any sensor system we have tested against. The fold space construction is undetectable. The resonance arrays are only active during tests, and the tests are calibrated to fall below the noise floor of the hegemony's monitoring systems. So they do not know. They do not know about Marathon, she said, but they may know something else. She paused, and in that pause was the quality of someone deciding how much to say. The test we ran 4 years ago, the first successful gate exclusion test, lasted 9 seconds before we restored the gate to normal function. We chose 9 seconds deliberately, because 9 seconds was the duration of the event that occurred when Dr. Ose first ran her sequence 60 years ago. We wanted to see if the hegemony would recognize the signature. Did they? We believe so. The hegemony's monitoring network registered the test as an anomalous resonance event. Their classified investigation, which we have limited access to through intelligence channels, described it as a possible repeat of the original 2297 incident. They concluded again that it was caused by external gravitational sources. But they investigated. They investigated for 3 years, she said, and they upgraded their gate monitoring systems afterward, which tells us they are not entirely confident in their own explanation. I thought about that. I thought about the 7 civilizations in Section 11. I thought about the grammatical construction that meant the speaker was frightened. Dr. Nakamura, I said, why did the hegemony really send the ultimatum? She looked at me with the careful attention of someone considering whether to share the most important thing they know with someone they have just met. We have a theory, she said. Would you like to hear it? Very much, I said. We believe, she said slowly, that the hegemony knows what happens when the gate network is fully activated, not partially activated, the way individual gate expansions or resonance tests activate it, fully, the way activating 50 or 60 gates simultaneously in the right sequence would activate it. What happens? We believe, she said, based on 60 years of analysis and a great deal of mathematics that I can walk you through, if you have several weeks, that the gate network is not just a transportation system. We believe it is a detection system, and we believe that when it is fully activated, it announces something. Announces what? The presence of the activation source, she said, to whoever built the gates. And there it was. The thing that had been sitting underneath everything else. The thing that made the 7 civilizations stop being detectable. The thing that made the hegemony's ultimatum read like a warning, from someone personally frightened, rather than a threat from someone in control. Something built the gates, I said. Something built the gates, she agreed. Approximately 4 billion years ago, based on material analysis. The hegemony has known this for thousands of years. They have, in all that time, never found any evidence of what that something is, or where it went. What they have found is a very consistent pattern across the civilizations that discovered gate biology independently. Those civilizations stopped being detectable. Yes, she said. Shortly after, in each case, a full gate network activation event was registered in the hegemony's historical monitoring records. And then nothing. Not destruction. Not departure. Nothing. I stood up from the chair I had been sitting in and walked to the small viewport in the corner of Dr. Nakamura's office, which looked out at the interior of the Fold Space construction complex, at the angular shapes of marathon ships arranged in silent rows in the impossible dark. And we are about to activate the full network, I said. Not deliberately, she said, but the hegemony believes that our modifications to gate technology, particularly the resonance array work, may produce a full activation as a side effect. They may be right. We have done the calculations and we believe the risk is present but manageable, if the activation sequence is controlled. And if it is not controlled? She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was precise and quiet, the way scientists' voices get when they are being very careful not to overstate something, but also very careful not to understate it. If it is not controlled, she said, then whoever built the gates will know we are here. And we will have no way of knowing what that means until it is already happening. I looked at the marathon ships in the dark. I thought about 50 million warships coming through the Soul Gate. And I thought about what I was going to say to Commander Sorvax when I finally had him on a private channel. Because Sorvax knew everything Grace Nakamura had just told me, and he had brought 50 million ships not to win a war, but because he had run out of other ideas for making us listen. And I thought about the fact that we had a plan. Marathon had always been a plan, but the plan had been built around the hegemony being the danger. If Grace Nakamura was right, the hegemony was not the danger at all. The danger was whatever had built the gates. And we had spent 60 years learning to speak the gates' language. Which meant, if we were not careful, we were about to say something very loud into a very old and very dark silence. And something might answer. Commander Sorvax agreed to the private channel without hesitation, which told me he had been waiting for exactly this kind of request for a very long time. His image resolved on the communication display in my office in real time, without the usual hegemony diplomatic processing delay. That was also deliberate. He was choosing clarity over protocol. When a Vethrani officer abandons diplomatic protocol, they are signaling that the content of what they are about to say matters more than the form it takes. Sorvax looked like most Vethrani looked to human eyes. Tall, with a proportional system slightly different from ours, with eyes that caught light from unexpected angles. He wore a commander's dress uniform that was plain by hegemony standards. He sat very still in his chair, in the way that Vethrani did when they were making an effort to appear non-threatening. He looked at me through the display for a moment before speaking. "Admiral Vasquez," he said through the translation layer, "I had hoped someone from your side would initiate this channel." "Commander Sorvax," I said, "I need to tell you that this conversation is being monitored by Earth Command." "I assumed so," he said. "I am being monitored by the Supreme Council. We are in the same situation, you and I. People watching us try to do something that should have been done 30 days ago. Before the deadline." "Before the deadline," he agreed. "Though I will tell you, in honesty, that the deadline was not the point. The deadline was the mechanism by which the Supreme Council could justify what you are currently looking at outside your viewport. 50 million ships were the argument we could not make with words." "They are a very large argument," I said. "They are the largest argument the hegemony has ever assembled," he said, and there was something in his translated voice that was not quite pride and not quite regret, and was somewhere between the two. "The Council assembled this fleet and sent it through the Soul Gate in the hope that the size of the demonstration would accomplish what the ultimatum did not. And what is that?" He looked at me with the particular directness that Vethrani used when they had decided to dispense with indirection entirely. "Make your people take seriously a danger that is not us," he said. I had known that was coming. I had known it since I read the grammatical constructions in the original transmission, but hearing it stated plainly still had a quality to it, an arrival of a thing you have been watching approach from a distance. "The 7 civilizations in Section 11 of your ultimatum," I said. Something shifted in Sorvax's expression. "You read the original, not the translation." "I read the original." "Most of your political and military leadership has only read the translation," he said. "The translation was prepared by Hegemony Diplomatic Services. It was accurate in terms of content. It was not accurate in terms of texture. The texture being that you are frightened." He was quiet for a moment. "The hegemony is a coalition of 642 civilizations," he said. "We have existed, in various forms and configurations, for approximately 12,000 of your years. In that time, we have encountered threats of every kind that interstellar civilizations produce. We have resolved most of them. Some we did not resolve but contained. A very small number we stepped carefully around because they were larger than us. And the thing that built the gates is not in any of those categories," he said. "The thing that built the gates is not larger than us in the way that a larger military is larger. It is larger than us in the way that the ocean is larger than a single boat. Qualitatively different. Of a different order of existence entirely." "Tell me about the 7 civilizations," I said. He did not look away. 3 of them were members of the hegemony, at various points in our history. The other 4 were independent civilizations that we had contact with. All 7 of them discovered, independently, that the gates were biological. All 7 began experimenting with gate resonance patterns. All 7 reached, at some point, what we have come to call the activation threshold, a level of resonance output that propagates through the entire gate network simultaneously. And then our monitoring records for each of those civilizations show a full network activation event, a simultaneous resonance burst from every gate in the network, at a frequency we have never been able to fully characterize, lasting approximately 43 of your seconds, after which our sensors could no longer detect any activity in the territory of the activating civilization, not their communications, not their ship movements, not their power generation, not the biological signatures of their populations. Their structures remained, I said, because this was in the hegemony archive records I had read, and I wanted him to know I had read them. Their structures remained, he confirmed. Their infrastructure remained. Their equipment, their stations, their ships that were not in transit at the moment of activation, all remained. What did not remain was any living thing, and nothing in those structures showed any sign of violence. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was disturbed. The civilizations existed in full, physical, material detail, and then there was no one in them. You think they were taken, I said. We think they were collected, he said, and the word he chose, even in translation, had a specific quality, not removed in anger, not destroyed, collected, the way a researcher collects a sample, carefully, completely, with attention to preserving the subject intact. I sat with that for a moment. The modifications your scientists have made to gate technology, Sorvax said, his translated voice carrying a quality that I was now certain was careful restraint over something much louder, produce resonance patterns that our monitoring systems have flagged multiple times in the last 20 years as potential threshold approach events. Not activations, not yet, but approaching. How close are we to threshold? Our analysts believe your current resonance technology, if deployed at scale, could reach threshold with a simultaneous activation of 40 to 70 gates, he said. You currently control 47 gates. The number sat between us on the channel. Commander Sorvax, I said, I am going to tell you something. It is not information I have authorization to share with you, so I am sharing it as an individual, rather than as a representative of Earth's military, and you should weight it accordingly. He nodded once. We know about threshold, I said. Our scientists have known for 60 years. We have been working on ways to approach it without crossing it. What we have built, in 6 decades of classified research, is a method of gate activation that we believe can be controlled. Not a full threshold event, a targeted, bounded activation with a specific purpose. What purpose? Gate exclusion, I said. The ability to close the gate network to any vessel not carrying our authorized signal, universally and simultaneously. Sorvax was very still for a moment. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of movement, but its deliberate restraint. You can shut the gates, he said. We believe so. All of them. All of them. Within 11 minutes of the command being sent. He looked at me with an expression that his face was not quite designed to carry in a way human faces would recognize, but which I read, with some confidence, as the expression of someone doing very rapid calculations. You have been building toward this for 60 years, he said. Yes. And our ultimatum arrived during this process. It arrived when we were approximately 4 years from being ready to deploy, I said. Our plan was to demonstrate the capability, and then use it as the foundation for a renegotiation of our relationship with the hegemony, from a position of actual parity, not to be conquered, or to conquer, to be equal. And instead you ignored the ultimatum. Earth's Senate ignored the ultimatum, I said. I read the original Vethrani. He looked at me. What did you understand from the original? That you were trying to protect us, not from the hegemony, from what might hear us if we activated the gates fully. Yes, he said simply. And you still believe that risk is present. The risk is always present, he said. The 7 civilizations reached threshold accidentally. None of them were trying to make noise. They were experimenting. The way your scientists have been experimenting. The activation was a side effect of their research, not their intention. The result was the same. We would not be activating accidentally, I said. We would be activating the exclusion sequence. A specific, controlled, bounded resonance pattern, not a full threshold event. You are certain of this distinction? Our scientists are certain, I said. I have spent 11 hours inside the facility that has been working on this for 60 years. The engineers are meticulous. The 7 civilizations also had meticulous engineers, he said, and his voice was very quiet. That was fair. I acknowledged it with a nod. Commander Sorvax, I said, you came through the Soul Gate with 50 million ships. You brought them all through the same gate. In military terms, that is not efficient. It concentrates your entire force in a single system, away from the rest of your territory, with one exit point. That is not a military formation. That is a demonstration. Yes, he said. And the demonstration is, we could end this. We are choosing not to. Listen to us. Yes. I am listening, I said, and I am telling you what we have built, not because I am threatening you with it. Because you need to know, if we are going to have an honest conversation about the gate network and what lives inside it, that we are not the naive civilization you thought you were protecting. We have been working on this problem for 60 years. We have answers you do not have. We also have risks you are right to be worried about. He was quiet for a long time after that, not the silence of offense or the silence of calculation, but the silence of someone genuinely integrating new information. What do you propose? He asked finally. I propose that we have the conversation your Supreme Council sent 50 million ships to force us to have, I said. The real one. About what built the gates, and what it does when the gates are activated, and what we do about the fact that both of our civilizations are now in a position where we cannot avoid this problem by simply stepping away from it. The gates are part of our infrastructure. They are part of yours. Whatever the risk of threshold activation, the alternative risk of deactivating the gate network entirely is not survivable for either of us. He nodded. That is correct. And I propose, I said, choosing my next words with extreme care, that we demonstrate the exclusion capability, not as a threat, not as a weapon, as a proof of concept, as evidence that gate activation can be controlled, that threshold can be approached and not crossed, that the noise we make can be shaped and bounded. He looked at me for a long moment. And if it cannot be controlled? If your demonstration crosses threshold? Then we have a much larger problem, I said, and we address it together. The channel was quiet for 5 seconds. Then Sorvac said, The Supreme Council is monitoring this channel. I know. I cannot commit to anything without their authorization. I know that too. But I can tell you, he said, that the Council sent me through that gate because they were out of options. Not because they wanted to dominate your civilization. Because they have watched 7 civilizations disappear, and they have spent 12,000 years being very careful around the gate network, and they watched humanity arrive with the energy and the complete disregard for established boundaries that your species is apparently famous for, and they panicked. We are a bit much, I agreed. Something shifted in his expression, and I was almost entirely certain it was the Vethrani equivalent of a reluctant smile. Authorization from the Supreme Council will take 4 of your hours, he said. The Council has 11 members, and 4 of them are Vethrani, and they will argue among themselves for at least 3 of those hours, regardless of what I say. I have a busy crew, I said. 4 hours is manageable. There is one condition, he said. Non-negotiable, from the Council. Name it. Your facility, he said. The one you have just told me about. The 60 years of research. Everything you have built. If we proceed with this jointly, the hegemony requires full access to that research. Not to control it, not to take it, to understand it. 12,000 years of careful avoidance, and your species solved the problem in 60. We would like to know how. I thought about that. It was a reasonable request. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of request that could form the foundation of something other than a confrontation. I will need 4 hours to get authorization for that from my command, I said. Convenient, he said. We ended the channel. I sat in my office and looked at the display showing 50 million hegemony warships holding position 800,000 kilometers from our gate, and I thought about how, an hour ago, this had looked like the most catastrophic situation humanity had ever faced. And now it looked like the beginning of something. Whether the something was good or catastrophic in a different way depended entirely on what happened when we activated the exclusion sequence, and what the activation did to the wider network. And what, if anything, was listening. I called Earth Command and asked for General Okafor. He picked up immediately, which meant he had been watching the whole conversation. Admiral Vasquez, he said. What do you need? 4 hours, I said, and authorization to share Marathon's research files with the hegemony. A very long pause. The complete files? Yes, sir. Claire, he said, which was the only time in 20 years he had used my first name in a professional context. Do you understand what you are about to do? I am about to activate a gate exclusion sequence with the knowledge and presence of the Hegemony Supreme Council, I said, and I am about to do it in a way that is either going to demonstrate controlled activation beyond any previous benchmark, or is going to activate the full gate network and announce our presence to whatever built it 4 billion years ago. And you believe we should proceed? Sir, I said, we have been building toward this for 60 years. We built it because we knew this moment was coming. Not this exact moment, but a moment like it. A moment where the choice between doing nothing and doing something was actually a choice between two different kinds of doing something, and we had to pick one. And you are picking the one where we activate the gates. I am picking the one where we do it on purpose, with our eyes open, with the hegemony beside us instead of across from us, and with 60 years of the best science humanity has ever produced standing behind the plan. He was quiet for a long time. Get me Sorvax, he said. I want to hear it from him directly. Yes, sir. And Claire, he said. Sir. If this works, no one outside this channel will ever know how close it came to being a complete disaster. And if it does not work, I asked. Then it will not matter, he said, and disconnected. I looked at the 50 million ships on my display and thought about meticulous engineers and 7 civilizations, and the thing that Grace Nakamura's voice had carried when she said, "We will have no way of knowing what that means until it is already happening." Then I opened a channel to the Soul Gate and began the sequence that would either prove we were ready or prove, very loudly and very irreversibly, that we were not. The timer on my display read 3 hours, 58 minutes. Somewhere in fold space, 50,000 marathon ships were already powering their resonance arrays. And every gate in the galaxy was about to hear us. The authorization came back in 3 hours and 42 minutes, which meant the Hegemony Supreme Council had argued for exactly 3 hours, as Sorvax had predicted, and then spent the remaining 42 minutes generating paperwork that 11 galactic civilizations required, even in emergencies. General Okafor had his conversation with Sorvax. I was not present for all of it, but Nate was in the room when the key parts were exchanged, and Nate told me afterward that Okafor had spent the first 15 minutes testing Sorvax in every way an experienced commander tests a counterpart they do not yet trust, and Sorvax had answered every test with a patience that Nate described as the patience of someone who has explained the same thing to 14 different civilizations and accepted, long ago, that this is simply part of the process. By the end of the conversation, Okafor had signed off on the marathon file share. Not the full 60 years of research, not immediately, but enough to demonstrate good faith. The complete transfer would take months and require a formal treaty that did not yet exist. But the agreement to transfer was real, and it was on record, and on the hegemony side it had been countersigned by 3 council members who Sorvax identified as the most skeptical voices on the council, and who, by signing, had committed the council's majority to the arrangement. That was, as Nate put it when he briefed me, not a small thing. In the meantime, the 50 million hegemony ships had adjusted their position. They were no longer holding at the courtesy distance. They had moved, in a coordinated formation that was genuinely remarkable to watch, into a loose arrangement that surrounded the Sol Gate at a radius of approximately 2 million kilometers, not surrounding it in a hostile sense. Surrounding it in the way that observers position themselves around a demonstration, close enough to see clearly, far enough to leave room to respond if something unexpected occurred. They were watching. The marathon fleet emerged from fold space, 11 minutes before the scheduled activation window. 50,000 ships, appearing simultaneously in the space around the Sol Gate, each one broadcasting its identification codes on the frequencies we had agreed to share with Sorvax. The appearance of 50,000 additional ships in an already crowded situation would, under other circumstances, have triggered an immediate defensive response from the hegemony vessels. Under these circumstances, the hegemony fleet held position and watched. I imagine the reports that reached the Supreme Council in those minutes were among the more unusual documents in their 12,000-year archive. An unauthorized human military force of 50,000 vessels, built inside a dimensional pocket that should not exist, appearing from nowhere around a gate that was already surrounded by the entirety of the hegemony's combat fleet, while the human commander who had just negotiated a research-sharing agreement with the hegemony Supreme Council watched from her flagship. The hegemony, to their significant credit, did not fire on anything. Sorvax hailed me immediately. "Your additional fleet has appeared," he said, with the tone of someone making an observation rather than a complaint. "The Marathon fleet," I said. "I apologize for the lack of advance notice. The emergence timing is not precisely controllable." "I assumed as much," he said. "Is this the fleet that will conduct the activation?" "Yes." "How long?" 11 minutes, I said. "We will begin the activation sequence on my mark. The exclusion command will propagate through the network in 11 minutes. All gates, including yours, will close to any vessel not carrying a marathon transponder for a period of 6 minutes. After 6 minutes, the exclusion will be lifted and normal transit will resume." 6 minutes, he said. 6 minutes is the shortest period that allows us to demonstrate the capability fully, while also giving your council confidence that this is a controlled event and not a threshold activation. "And you are certain it is not a threshold activation?" "Dr. Grace Nakamura is certain," I said. "She has been working on this specific question for 29 years. The exclusion sequence is bounded. It does not approach the threshold frequencies. The mathematical model is complete and has been tested 47 times. "Your scientists have been wrong before," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "So have yours. The question is, whether the evidence we have supports the confidence we are placing in this plan. I believe it does. Dr. Nakamura believes it does. You have now read enough of the marathon files to assess the quality of the work. What do you think?" A pause. "I think," Sorvax said carefully, "that your species has done something remarkable in 60 years, that the hegemony did not do in 12,000. I think the work is extraordinary. I also think that the 7 civilizations whose records you have now read were also extraordinary, and they are not here anymore. They did not have 60 years of specific research into controlled activation," I said. "They were working with partial understanding, and they crossed threshold accidentally. We have mapped the threshold frequencies. We know exactly where they are. The exclusion sequence does not go near them. You are certain?" "I am certain enough to stake this on it," I said, "which is what I am doing." He was quiet for a moment. "Admiral Vasquez," he said, "if this works, the relationship between your civilization and the hegemony will need to be rebuilt from the beginning. Everything we assumed about the balance of power, about who has what and why, will need to be renegotiated. I know. If this does not work," he said, "we will all face something much larger than either of our civilizations. And we will face it together, because neither of us will have a choice. I know that too." Another pause. Then, very simply, "Mark." I looked at my display. The Marathon fleet's resonance arrays were at full charge. The Soul Gate was already beginning to shift in response to their proximity, a low-level resonance building in the gate structure that our sensors could feel as a kind of vibration in the fabric of local space. "Marathon Control," I said on the internal command channel. "This is Admiral Vasquez. Activation authorized. Begin exclusion sequence." The voice that answered was Dr. Grace Nakamura's, because she had insisted on being at the activation console personally, and I had not argued with her. "Understood," she said. "Exclusion sequence beginning. Timer. 11 minutes to network propagation." What happened next is difficult to describe in terms that correspond to normal sensory experience, because what happened next was not primarily visible or audible. It was, in the first moments, simply a feeling, a vibration that was not quite sound, a pressure that was not quite force. The Rubicon's hull resonated very faintly, a frequency so low it was felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears, and every officer on the bridge looked at each other for a brief moment, with the shared expression of people confirming that the thing they felt was real. On the display, the Sol Gate was changing. The Marathon ship's arrays were transmitting Dr. Osei's mathematical sequence, modified over 60 years into something more precise and more controlled than anything she had originally envisioned, and the gate was receiving it the way a very old instrument receives the right note, with resonance, with recognition, with a response that was not mechanical but organic, the response of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to speak to it correctly. The gate did not expand this time. That had been the first test. The brute demonstration. The thing the hegemony had done to make their point. This was something different. The gate's output frequency shifted, moving through a range that our sensors tracked in real time, and the shift propagated outward through the wormhole connection, traveling through the mathematical substrate of space, faster than any conventional signal could travel. Grace Nakamura's voice came through the command channel, steady and quiet. "Propagation confirmed," she said. "Network response beginning. We are receiving acknowledgement signals from 12 gates so far. 21. 38. Threshold frequencies?" I asked. "Well below," she said. "The model is holding." I released a breath I had been holding since the sequence started. The hegemony ships around the Sol gate did not move, but on the channel I was maintaining with Sorvax, I could hear, in the background, the sound of hegemony officers receiving reports. Not alarmed reports, uncertain ones. Reports from gate monitoring stations across hegemony space, all delivering the same observation. Something is happening to the gates, but it is not the thing we were afraid of. That distinction, I suspected, was the most important thing that had happened in this conversation. 4 minutes, Grace said. All gates in the network are responding. No anomalous frequencies. Exclusion propagating cleanly. On my secondary display, the schematic of the gate network showed each gate in the system, changing color as the exclusion sequence reached it. Green, for confirmed, and responsive. Yellow for in progress. The map of the galaxy, rendered in the simplified form our display used, was turning green, at a pace that was actually slower than my anxiety wanted, but was, according to Grace, entirely correct. "Sorvax," I said on the channel. "I am watching," he said. His voice was different than it had been in the conversation. Not calmer, precisely, but different, more focused, more present. "What are your monitoring stations showing?" "An anomalous resonance event," he said. "Similar in some respects to the historical threshold activation signatures. Dissimilar in the specific frequencies. Our analysts are describing it as a gate network response in the exclusion band, whatever that means to your people." "It means it is working," I said. "Yes," he said. "It appears to be working." 6 minutes, Grace said. "Network fully engaged. Exclusion active. Any vessel without a marathon transponder attempting gate transit will be rejected." "Test it," I said. A pause. Then Grace said, "Rubicon, we are going to attempt to send an automated probe through the Sol gate on a standard transit request from the hegemony side. The probe is not carrying a marathon transponder." Owen, at Communications, confirmed the probe launch from a hegemony monitoring drone that we had arranged access to as part of the joint protocol. The drone launched. It approached the Sol gate on a standard transit trajectory. The gate rejected it. Not violently. Not with any visible effect. The probe's transit request was simply not acknowledged. The gate, which had processed millions of transits in its operational lifetime with mechanical reliability, declined to process this one. Cleanly, completely, without any apparent stress to its structure. The probe drifted past the gate on its original trajectory, untransited, and continued into open space. The bridge of the Rubicon was completely silent. I looked at Nate. He was looking at the display. His expression was the expression of a man who had believed, abstractly, that this was possible, and who was now experiencing the shift from abstract belief to concrete reality. "That is," he said quietly, "a very significant thing." "Yes," I said. On the command channel, Grace Nakamura said, "Exclusion holding. Threshold frequencies stable. No anomalous readings. The model is accurate." On the Sorvax channel, silence. Not hostile silence. The silence of someone processing something that has fundamentally altered their understanding of a situation. I gave him that silence for 30 seconds. Then I said, "Commander Sorvax, your monitoring stations across hegemony space. What are they showing?" He answered slowly. "They are showing," he said, "that every gate in the hegemony network is in the same state as your Sol gate, responsive to local environmental factors, unresponsive to transit requests from vessels without your transponder. Every gate we monitor," he said, "which is most of them. I am being told that in the outer regions, where our monitoring is less dense, we cannot confirm, but the propagation should have reached them by now, based on the timing you described. It has, Grace said on the open channel. She had been listening. Network coverage is complete. All gates confirmed in exclusion state. I let that land. 50 million hegemony warships, on the wrong side of the Sol Gate from their home territory, with every gate in the hegemony network closed behind them. The most powerful military force in the known galaxy, stranded in a single star system, at the discretion of humanity. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because this is a story that will be told and retold, and the feeling matters. It was not triumph. It was not relief, though there was some relief in it. It was the particular feeling of a thing you have worked toward for a very long time, being exactly as large as you always knew it would be, which is different from what most people expect it to feel like. It felt like responsibility. Enormous, immediate, absolute responsibility for what happened next. Commander Sorvax, I said. In approximately 90 seconds, Dr. Nakamura is going to begin the lift sequence. The exclusion will be released. All gates will return to normal function. Your fleet will be free to transit home. I know, he said. I am telling you explicitly, so that it is on the record, I said. We are not holding your fleet. We are not using this as leverage. We are demonstrating the capability, and then releasing it. Because the point was never to trap you. The point was to show you that this conversation needs to happen between equals. A long pause. You could have kept the exclusion in place indefinitely, he said. We could have, I agreed. But you are not. We are not. Another pause. Longer this time. Admiral Vasquez, he said. I was given a mission by the Supreme Council. That mission was to deliver the ultimatum, demonstrate the hegemony's military capacity, and secure compliance. I have failed at all three of those objectives. I know, I said. I am sorry for making your position complicated. Do not be, he said. And now his translated voice carried something that I recognized, after a moment, as genuine. I was given that mission because the Council could not think of any other option. You have given us another option. That is not a failure of my mission. That is the mission succeeding in a way no one on the Council imagined. 60 seconds, Grace said. Commander Sorvax, I said, after the exclusion lifts, I would like to request a formal joint conference. Your Council, our command authority, and the Marathon research team. There are things we know about the Gate network that you do not know. There are things you know that we do not. The 7 civilizations and what happened to them. The threshold frequencies. What happens when the network is fully activated. We need to understand all of it together. Yes, he said simply. And there is something else, I said. He waited. Our research suggests that full network activation, the kind that the 7 civilizations experienced, does not destroy them, I said. It collects them, intact, preserved. Whatever built the gates was thorough enough to keep what it found. The silence on the channel was absolute. You believe they still exist, he said. I believe it is possible, I said. I believe that understanding threshold activation well enough to control it, rather than avoid it, might be the difference between being collected and being in a position to understand what the collection means. 30 seconds, Grace said. That is, Sorvax said slowly, a very different way of thinking about this problem than any the hegemony has used in 12,000 years. We are a bit like that, I said. The gate exclusion lifted at exactly the 6-minute mark. The change was visible on sensors as a shift in the gate's ambient output, and it propagated back through the network in the same 11-minute window, restoring normal function to every gate in the galaxy. The probe that had been drifting in open space, unparsed by the exclusion gate, had traveled approximately 300 kilometers during its 6-minute exclusion. It was not recoverable. We did not try to recover it. It had done its job. On the Sorvax channel, I could hear the background sound of hegemony officers receiving the restoration confirmation from their monitoring stations. The gates were open. The fleet could go home. The fleet did not go home. The 50 million hegemony warships held their position at the 2 million kilometer radius around the Sol Gate, and Commander Sorvax requested a formal conference channel, and General Okafor, who had been watching everything from Earth Command, said yes before I had finished forwarding the request. I turned my chair away from the display for a moment and looked at the viewport. Outside, the stars were the same as they had always been, but the space between them felt different now. Not safer, not more dangerous, just more known. More honest about what it contained and what it did not, what it hid and what it was waiting to reveal. Nate came and stood beside me at the viewport, which was becoming something of a habit. "Well," he said. "Well," I agreed. "That worked," he said. "It did. The part where we trapped 50 million ships and then let them go on purpose," he said. "That was a deliberate choice." It was. I want to be on record as saying I was not entirely sure about it until about 30 seconds ago. "You were not alone," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "The part where something might have built the gates and might have collected 7 civilizations and might still have them," he said. "Yes? Are we going to look into that?" I looked at the stars. "Nate," I said, "we are absolutely going to look into that." He nodded, with the particular expression of a man who has known, for a very long time, that his life was not going to be simple and has made his peace with it. "I am going to need more coffee," he said. "Get some for me too," I said, and we went back to work. The joint conference lasted 19 days, and on the 16th day, a hegemony colony called Vestor Prime went silent. Not slowly, not gradually. One moment it was there, active, and transmitting on 17 regular frequencies. The next moment it was not. I know the exact time because I was in the middle of a working session with 3 hegemony scientists and 2 of my own, when every display in the room changed simultaneously, overridden by an emergency broadcast from the hegemony's deep monitoring network. The 3 hegemony scientists went completely still, and one of them, a Vethrani named researcher Oral, who had spent the last 16 days working alongside Grace Nakamura, with a focus that had made me genuinely respect him, stood up from his chair and said something in unfiltered Vethrani that our translation systems took a moment to parse. What he said, when the translation arrived, was, "It has begun." Vestor Prime was home to 400 million people. It was located in the outer reaches of hegemony space, in a region that had been settled for approximately 3,000 years and was considered stable. It had 6 gates of its own and was a transit hub for 12 surrounding systems. Its loss, in purely logistical terms, was significant. Its loss in terms of 400 million living beings was a number I did not have a useful way to think about in the moment, so I set it aside and focused on what the data was telling us. The data told us several things. First, the monitoring records for Vestor Prime showed a full network activation event beginning approximately 43 seconds before the colony went silent, not originating from Vestor Prime, originating from something that had entered the local gate network from outside it, which was a phrase that meant nothing in any physics framework we possessed, but which the data indicated nonetheless. Second, the network activation event matched, in every measurable parameter, the historical records of the 7 threshold events that the hegemony had on file. Duration, 43 seconds. Frequency spread, identical. Geographic scope, every gate within a 30 light-year radius of Vestor Prime. Third, and this was the thing that made Grace Nakamura very quiet, in a way that was different from her ordinary quietness. The network activation at Vestor Prime had originated before our exclusion sequence test. The timing, when adjusted for propagation delays, indicated that whatever produced the activation at Vestor Prime had been triggered 3 days before the Marathon fleet ran its demonstration. Our activation had not caused this, but our activation had been preceded by something that had already noticed us. I called a meeting of every senior person on both sides immediately, and I did not soften the briefing. There was no productive version of softening it, because the data was the data, and the people in that room had spent 16 days building the kind of fragile trust that only survives if no one cheats on the honesty. Sorvax sat at the table with his diplomatic and scientific team. General Okafor was present by secure channel from Earth Command. Grace Nakamura was at the table in person, because she had not left the joint conference facility since it started, and showed no signs of starting to leave. The 3 hegemony scientists were there. Nate was there. Owen was outside the room managing communication traffic, which was considerable. I laid out the data. The room was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then Sorvax said, Vester Prime's colony infrastructure. Is it intact? Based on the sensor data we have from the monitoring relay that captured the event, I said. Yes. The physical structures appear undamaged. We are not reading any biological signatures from the planet's surface or its orbital stations. 400 million people, he said, not a question. Just the number. Yes. Intact infrastructure. No biological signatures. No distress signals. No debris. Correct. He sat with that in the way Vethrani sat with large things, very still, with a quality that looked like calm, but was in fact the opposite of calm. The same pattern, he said. The same pattern, I agreed. Identical, in every respect we can measure, to the 7 historical events. Then they are collected, he said, as you proposed. If our theory is correct, I said, then 400 million people are intact, somewhere, in whatever state the gate builders maintain their collections. And the theory suggests they can be reached, he said. The theory suggests it is possible, I said carefully. Not certain, not straightforward. The mechanism for how the collection works, and therefore for how to interact with what is collected, is something we have been working on for 16 days, and have not yet solved. But you have ideas, said researcher Aurel, who had returned to his seat and was now leaning forward over the table, with the particular focus of a scientist who has stopped being frightened because the problem has gotten interesting enough to override the fear. We have ideas, Grace said from her seat. Some of them are strange. All of the correct ideas in this situation will be strange, Aurel said. Please share them. Grace shared them. The core of what she had developed, over 60 years of gate research and 16 days of frantic collaboration with the Hegemony science team, was a framework for thinking about what the gate network actually was. Not a transportation system, not just a detection system, something more complete than either. A record, she called it. The gate network, in her framework, was a record-keeping system of enormous antiquity, built by something that collected what it considered significant and preserved it, not in a location, but in the network itself, in the fold space substrate through which gate travel was possible. The 7 civilizations that reached threshold, she said, were not destroyed. They were archived. The gate network, when fully activated by a civilization that had developed gate language to a sufficient degree, interprets that civilization as significant enough to preserve. It archives them in fold space, intact, complete, preserved in the same mathematical substrate that makes gate travel possible. And the structures that remain, Sorvac said, the intact planets, the empty stations. Shells, Grace said. Not empty, present. The people, the living things, the consciousness of the civilization, exists in fold space. The physical structures remain as markers, perhaps, the way you might mark a book. The information is stored. The physical volume remains on the shelf. Can they communicate? Aurel asked. We believe so, Grace said. We believe the fold space substrate is not a static archive but a dynamic one. The things stored in it are not preserved in the way you preserve a specimen in a container. They are preserved in the way you preserve a conversation, by recording not just the words but the capacity for more words. They are still alive, I said. We believe they are still alive, Grace said, and her voice was very careful. In fold space. In the network. Existing in a state that is different from biological existence but is not simply death. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the quiet that had followed the briefing about Vester Prime. That quiet had been the quiet of scale and loss. This quiet was the quiet of a door that might open. The question, Grace continued, is whether we can speak to them. The gate network is biological. We know how to speak to it. What we do not know is whether the things stored inside it are accessible through the same language. How would you test that? Aurel asked. By going in, she said simply. Every person in the room looked at her. Not permanently, she said. Not a full threshold activation. A controlled fold space entry, using the marathon ship's resonance arrays to maintain a tether to normal space. A person, or a very small team, in a marathon vessel configured as a deep fold space probe, transmitting Dr. Osei's sequence from inside the network rather than from outside it. You are describing, Sorvac said slowly, entering fold space deliberately. Yes? And the difference between that and what happens to civilizations at threshold is scale and control, she said. A threshold activation takes an entire civilization at once, whether it is ready or not, because the gate network registers the civilization as a whole, rather than as individuals. A deliberate fold space entry, in a single vessel, transmitting a controlled sequence, would not reach threshold. It would be, in the gate network's terms, a very small knock on a very large door. And if something answers that knock, Oral asked. Then we talk, Grace said. We have been learning the language for 60 years. If the gate network's archived civilizations exist in the fold space substrate, and if they retain the capacity for communication, then speaking to them is a question of using the language correctly. General Okafor's voice came through the secure channel from Earth Command. Dr. Nakamura, he said, you are describing a single person going into fold space in a small vessel, with the intention of communicating with entities that may or may not still exist, in a state we cannot fully define. Yes, she said. Who would do that? Grace looked at me. I looked at her. I had known, at some level, since she described the theory, that this was where the conversation was going to end up. Not because I was the most qualified person in the room, and not because I was the most experienced, though I had more fold space exposure through the marathon tests than almost anyone else alive. I had known because the kind of conversation that needed to happen in fold space, if the archived civilizations could communicate, was not a scientific conversation. It was not a military one. It was a conversation between someone who understood what had been done to the archived civilizations and could speak to them as one thinking being to others, with honesty, and without the kind of professional distance that made scientists careful in situations where careful was not what was needed. It should be me, I said. Admiral, Okafor said. Sir, I said. With respect, I am the person in this configuration who knows the most about what we are walking into, has the most experience with Marathon's fold space environments, and can make the kind of judgment calls in the moment that this situation will require. I also have access to the full joint research at this point, which means I can speak to whatever we find with the most complete understanding available. This is not a volunteer situation, he said. I know, I said. I am not volunteering. I am recommending myself, which is different, and I am asking you to authorize it. A pause, a very long pause. Sorvax, Okafor said on the channel. Yes, Sorvax said. Does your council support this plan? My council, Sorvax said, has just lost 400 million people to a fold space collection event. My council will support any reasonable plan to understand what happened to them. Sending one human admiral into fold space in a controlled manner is the most reasonable option we have heard in 16 days. Yes, we support it. Very well, Okafor said. Admiral Vasquez, you are authorized. Dr. Nakamura, how long to prepare a suitable vessel? The vessel is ready, Grace said. It has been ready for 4 years. I built it in case we needed it. I looked at her. You built it 4 years ago, I said. I build things in case we need them, she said. It is how I think. The vessel was a Marathon Scout modified beyond anything the standard specifications described. Single occupant, built around a resonance array so large that it occupied nearly 60% of the ship's internal volume, fold space capable to a depth that no other Marathon vessel had been tested at. It had a name on its hull, the Osei, after Dr. Amara Osei, who had knocked on a door 60 years ago without knowing that was what she was doing. I boarded the Osei 6 hours after the joint conference ended. Grace ran the pre-flight with me personally, which took 4 hours, because every system in the Osei had redundancies built on redundancies, and Grace checked each one herself before she would allow me to take the ship into anything deeper than standard fold space. She was thorough in the way that people who have been thinking about a problem for 29 years are thorough. Not slow, but complete. She did not skip anything. When she was done, she stood at the hatch and looked at me. The sequence to initiate deep fold entry is in the primary console, she said. The tether protocol is automatic once you are 50 kilometers into fold space. The resonance array will run the communication sequence continuously from the moment you enter. If there is anything in there to hear, it will hear you. And if there is something there, I said, How will I know how to talk to it? She considered that seriously, the way she considered everything. The gate network's language is mathematical, she said. What is stored in it, if our theory is right, is more than mathematical. It is the full record of the archived civilizations, people, languages, history, memory. She paused. I think you talk to it the way you would talk to a person who has been somewhere you have not, and you want to understand what it was like. Curiosity, I said. Genuine curiosity, she said. Not scientific curiosity. The kind where you actually care about the answer, not just about the data it generates. I nodded. I can do that. I know, she said. That is why I looked at you when they asked who should go. She closed the hatch. I sat in the single seat of the OSE and looked at the console for a moment, and then I initiated the fold entry sequence, and the ship slid sideways out of conventional space, in a way that I can only describe by saying that the word sideways is a metaphor for something that has no accurate word. Fold space was nothing like I had expected, even though I had been inside fold space many times during marathon tests, because those tests had been at the shallow end, and this was not the shallow end. The shallow end was dark and quiet, and felt like being in a very still room. Deep fold space was not dark, or rather, it was dark in the way that something full of light, that has no color you can name, is dark, and it was not quiet at all. It was full of pattern. I do not have a better word. The fold space substrate, at depth, was layered with patterns that the OSE's sensors could not characterize, and my eyes could not make sense of, but which I could perceive with something that was not quite any of my five senses, as though the patterns were being received by something in me that did not usually have anything to receive. It was not comfortable, it was not frightening, it was simply unlike anything else. The resonance array activated automatically at the 50-kilometer mark, exactly as Grace had said. I felt it through the hull rather than hearing it. The OSE was transmitting Dr. OSE's sequence at the frequency that 60 years of refinement had made maximally clear and maximally unambiguous in the gate network's native language. For 11 minutes, nothing answered. Then something did. The answer was not in the form of words. It was not in any form I had a name for. It arrived as a change in the pattern surrounding the OSE, a response in the fold space fabric itself, and the response was in the mathematical language of the gates, which I had spent the last 16 days learning as thoroughly as I could, and what it said, translated from mathematics into the nearest available approximation of language, was, "We have been waiting for someone to knock." The conversation that followed lasted, by my personal sense of time, approximately 6 hours. By the Rubicon's external clock, according to Grace when I came out, it lasted 11 minutes. Time is different in fold space. This is not a metaphor. I spoke to something that was not quite any of the 7 archived civilizations individually, and was not quite all of them collectively, but was something in between, something that the fold space substrate had made of them over a very long time. It had the quality of many voices speaking with one intention, which was not agreement or unanimity but convergence, the convergence of many separate understandings around a shared experience. I asked it what had happened to the civilizations at Threshold. It told me, in mathematics and in something beyond mathematics, that threshold activation was not an accident of gate biology. It was the gate network's purpose. The thing that built the gates 4 billion years ago had built them as a kind of invitation. A filter, perhaps, or a test. Civilizations that learned the gates well enough to reach threshold had learned enough to be worth preserving. The network collected them, not as specimens but as participants. In what? I asked. In something that is not yet complete, it said. What will it be when it is complete? It did not answer that question directly. Instead, it showed me something, in the fold space fabric, that I can describe only approximately, a pattern of patterns, enormously complex, enormously old, with gaps in it. Many gaps, the shape of a thing that is being built slowly, across billions of years, from the civilizations that the gates find worth preserving. 7 of those gaps were fresh. One of them had the shape of a civilization of 400 million people. I thought about that. Then I asked, is the collection voluntary? The answer to that took longer than any other answer. It came in pieces, over what felt like a long time. The approximation of what it said was, it is not involuntary in the way that harm is involuntary. The network recognized something worth preserving, and preserved it. Whether the thing preserved would have chosen differently, if it had been asked, is a question the network's builders did not address. They assumed that what is worth preserving would understand, eventually, why it was preserved. You are saying they did not ask permission, I said. Something in the pattern shifted. Not discomfort exactly, but the fold space equivalent of a long pause before a careful answer. They did not know, it said, that the preserved would have views on the matter. I sat with that for a moment that lasted, in fold space time, long enough to think it through from several angles. They did not know, I said, because the civilizations at Threshold were the first things the network ever preserved that were capable of having views on the matter. A pause. Then, yes. And the archived civilizations, the 7 historical ones, the 400 million from Vestor Prime, they are aware that they have views on the matter? Yes. And they have communicated those views to the network? Over a very long time, yes. And the network is capable of releasing them? Another long pause. Longer than any previous one. The network has never released a preserved civilization, it said. The mechanism exists. It was built into the original design, the way a door is built with the capacity to open in both directions. But the mechanism has never been used, because no civilization outside the network has ever learned the language well enough to ask for it. You are telling me, I said slowly, that the mechanism exists, that the archived civilizations want to use it, and that no one has ever asked in the right language. Approximation, yes. I have been learning the language for 16 days, I said. My colleagues have been learning it for 60 years. If I asked, in the right way, with the right sequence, would the mechanism work? The pause that followed was the longest pause in the conversation. It lasted long enough that I began to wonder if the conversation was over. Then, we do not know. The mechanism exists. Whether 60 years of learning is sufficient to operate it correctly is something we cannot calculate from inside the network. It requires someone outside. I said, I need to go back. Yes, I said, I am going to come back with help. The pattern in the fold space around the OSE shifted in a way that I interpreted, correctly or incorrectly, as something like relief. I initiated the tether recall, and the OSE pulled back through 50 kilometers of fold space, and entered conventional space 4 minutes later, 200 meters from the Rubicon, which was the closest Grace's navigation system would allow the re-entry point to be. I sat in the pilot seat for a moment before I opened the hatch. Then I called Grace on the internal comms. The mechanism exists, I said. The archives can be opened from the outside, but only if the language is used correctly. You need to build me a new sequence. Grace was quiet for 4 seconds. How complex? She asked. More complex than anything we have built before, I said. But the fold space substrate will cooperate. It wants this to work. How long do we have? She asked. I thought about that. The network had found the hegemony civilization worth preserving for 12,000 years, and had not collected them. The threshold test had always been the gate language, not the calendar. As long as we did not cross threshold accidentally or deliberately before we had the release sequence ready, we had time. Long enough, I said, but let's not waste it. I opened the hatch. Nate was the first person I saw when I came out of the OSE. He looked at my face, and then he looked at the data readout from the OSE's systems, and then he looked at my face again. You were in there for 11 minutes, he said. I know, I said. How long did it feel like? 6 hours, I said. He nodded, accepting that the way he accepted most things, without excessive reaction, with complete acknowledgement. Did you find what we were looking for? I thought about the pattern of patterns, the gaps shaped like civilizations, the mechanism built into a 4-billion-year-old door. I found something better, I said. I found out that the door opens from our side. He looked at me for a moment. And the 400 million people from Vestor Prime, he asked, are waiting, I said. They have been waiting a long time. We should not keep them waiting any longer than we have to. Nate nodded once. Then he called Grace and Oral and the rest of the joint team to the main conference room, and I followed him down the corridor of the Rubicon with the particular feeling of someone who has just received information that changes the size of the problem they are working on. The problem was not smaller, but it was solvable. That was new. That was, in fact, everything. They gave me a chair at the Galactic Council table, 14 months after I came back from Fold Space. The chair was sized for a Vethrani, which meant it was half my height and twice my width, and I sat in it the way you sit in something built for a different kind of body, with adjustment, with a certain amount of good humor, and with the understanding that what matters is being in the room, not how you look in the furniture. The council chamber itself was located on Hegemony Central, a station the size of a small moon that had been constructed, in parts, over the last 4,000 years at the approximate gravitational center of the territory governed by the 642 member civilizations. I had been there 4 times before this council session, always as a representative observer, always with the specific status of a person who is present, but not formally included. This was the first session at which I held a council seat. It was also the first session at which researcher Aurel held a council seat, which was interesting, because Aurel was not technically a council member from any hegemony civilization. He held his seat as a representative of the Gate Research Joint Directorate, which was the formal body that had emerged from the 16 days of joint conference aboard the Rubicon, and had, in the 14 months since, grown into something that none of the 14-month ago people would have predicted. The Directorate employed, at last count, 912 scientists and engineers from 31 different civilizations, including 17 human beings who had left their Earth-based positions to work full-time at the Fold Space Research Facility that was now jointly operated in the Neptune Fold rather than exclusively by Marathon. It had a budget sourced from both Earth's military research allocation and the Hegemony's Science Council, which meant it was perpetually in the middle of 3 separate budgetary arguments simultaneously, which Grace Nakamura described as an ideal environment for getting real work done, because no one could agree on what the work should stop being. Grace herself did not hold a council seat. She held something that the council had created specifically for her, because none of the existing categories fit, which was the title of Principal Investigator for the Gate Network Project, which meant she had access to every council session as an expert resource, but was not bound by any council member's obligation to represent a constituency. She had described this arrangement as having all the information and none of the politics, which was exactly correct and exactly what she wanted. I sat in the Vethrani chair and listened to the opening statements that began every council session, which were long and formal and conducted in the high diplomatic register of the council's official language, and I thought about what the 14 months had produced. The release sequence had taken 9 months to develop, 9 months of the most intensive collaborative science I had ever witnessed, with Grace and Aurel at the center of it, and a rotating cohort of specialists from across the Joint Directorate feeding information, testing models, and arguing about methodology in 3 languages simultaneously. The Fold Space substrate had been, as I had described to them after coming out of the OSE, cooperative. When the Directorate's researchers ran limited Fold Space probes to test elements of the sequence, the network responded with what Grace called unprecedented clarity, which was the technical way of saying it was actively helping. The archived civilizations inside the Fold Space substrate had, over the millions of years of their preservation, developed a profound understanding of the network's language. They were not imprisoned in ignorance. They had been talking to the network's structure for a very long time. When the Directorate's probes began knocking on the outer edge of the Fold Space environment, the archived civilizations had, in effect, started helping from the inside. 2 things in Fold Space, working on the same problem from opposite sides. This, it turned out, was much more efficient than one thing working on it from one side alone. The first successful partial release was conducted 8 months into the development cycle, a small test, using a single archive cluster that had been identified as a stable boundary element. What came through was not a civilization. It was a pattern of information, a compressed record of one of the 7 historical civilizations, extracted from Fold Space into a format that the Directorate systems could read. Not living people. Not yet, but the complete record of a people who had believed, for as long as they had existed in Fold Space, that their preservation was also their ending. The record contained their understanding of what they had experienced. Reading it took 3 weeks, because it was not a document or a database in any form that human or hegemony systems were designed to process. It was something more like a very long memory, encoded in the Gate Network's mathematical language, covering approximately 800 years of post-threshold existence. The team that processed it worked in shifts, and emerged from each shift with the particular expression of people who have been trying to count something very large for a very long time, and have not finished counting. What the record said, summarized very inadequately, was this: preservation was disorienting. The moment of threshold had been frightening, in the way that any sudden and total transformation is frightening. The fold space existence that followed was different from physical existence, but was not the absence of existence. The archived civilization had found, over time, that they could communicate within the network, could collaborate with each other and with the other archived civilizations, could continue to develop and change and think in ways that physical existence had constrained. They had also found, over the same time, that they very much wanted to know that something outside knew they were there. The release of that record was followed, 3 months later, by the development of the full release mechanism. The Directorate sent me back into the OSE for a second fold space entry to verify the mechanism with the archived network entities directly, which I did, and which took 30 minutes of external time and what felt like 3 days of conversation, during which the mathematical language came to me more easily than it had the first time, because I had spent 9 months studying it, with the full attention of someone who knows they will need it. The network confirmed the release mechanism was correct. The release of Vester Prime's 400 million people began on the first day of the month, that Earth's calendar called the 14th month after the joint conference, and it took 48 hours. 48 hours is a very long time when you are sitting at a monitoring station watching a process you have spent 9 months developing and are not entirely certain will work correctly, even though all your calculations say it will. It is a very short time when you consider that 400 million people are on the other end of it. The re-entry was not dramatic, in the visual sense. There were no flashes of light, no sudden presence. The people of Vester Prime did not materialize out of thin air in their original positions. The release mechanism worked through the gate network in the same way that the original collection had worked, through the gates themselves, through the biological substrate, with the gates as the conduit between fold space and physical space. The people of Vester Prime came back through their own gates, over 48 hours, in groups that the network organized based on proximity of their fold space locations to the gates' release points. What this looked like, from the outside, was that the gates of Vester Prime began to glow, very faintly, in a frequency range that was slightly outside normal visible light, and stayed glowing for 48 hours, and then the stations and habitats and planetary settlements of Vester Prime began registering biological signatures again. 400 million people, alive, intact, bewildered, frightened, and, in the majority of cases, once they understood what had happened, and that they were back, unambiguously glad to be there. The medical assessment teams that went in, immediately after the last re-entry, confirmed what the fold space entities had told me. No physical harm, no neurological damage, some disorientation, some difficulty, in the first days, distinguishing between the fold space experience of time and the physical experience of time, which manifested as people being convinced they had been preserved for a much shorter period than the monitoring data showed. This resolved, in most cases, within 2 weeks. There were long-term psychological questions that the medical teams identified and began addressing, and those questions are ongoing, and they are complicated, and they are exactly the kind of complicated that takes years and careful attention and does not resolve in 48 hours. I do not want to minimize that. 400 million people experience something that no psychological literature had prepared any treatment framework for, and working through that experience is real and difficult and is still happening. But they came back. All of them. And after them, working backward through the historical events, the Directorate and the network's archived entities began the process of identifying and releasing the 7 historical civilizations. That process is still ongoing. It is enormously complex. Some of those civilizations have been in fold space for thousands of years, and their re-entry into physical space requires preparation on the physical side that takes time, places to go, infrastructure to rebuild, communities that no longer exist in the form they left. But the 7 civilization records confirmed the same thing that Vester Prime's 400 million confirmed. They wanted to come back. They had wanted, in many cases for a very long time, for someone on the outside to ask. Researcher Orel, when the Vester Prime release was complete, sat very still in his chair for about 3 minutes. Then he said, quietly, that he needed to contact his family, who lived in a system adjacent to Vestor Prime and who had believed, for 4 months, that 400 million people were simply gone. I let him make that call privately. Some moments are not for observers. At the Galactic Council session, 14 months after the joint conference, I sat in the Vethrani chair and listened to the opening statements. And when my turn came to speak, I gave a report on the Directorate's progress that was factual and precise, and probably somewhat dry for the newer members of the Council, who had not been present for any of the events that had led to it. I gave the numbers for Vestor Prime's re-entry. I gave the status of the historical civilization releases. I gave the current state of the Gate Network's cooperation with the Directorate's ongoing research. And then I said something that was not in my prepared notes. I said, "It is worth considering that the entity that built the gates 4 billion years ago did not make an error in not asking for consent. It made an error in not imagining that what it preserved would eventually have access to someone who could ask for consent on their behalf. This is a failure of imagination, not of intention. The preservation mechanism was built with a release function from the beginning. Whoever built the gates knew, at the moment of building, that preservation might someday need to be undone, and they built accordingly. They simply did not imagine that the preserved themselves would develop the capacity to want undoing." The council was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then Sorvax, who had been elevated to council representative for the Vethrani Directorate in the months since the joint conference, and who sat 2 seats to my right, with the slightly settled quality of a person who has resolved something that was occupying a great deal of their internal space, said, "Are you saying that whatever built the gates expected this?" "I am saying," I replied, "that the presence of a release mechanism suggests they thought about it. Whether they expected it, or hoped for it, or simply built it as responsible engineering, I cannot say. The network itself does not have that information, or if it does, it has not shared it with us." "Perhaps," said a council member from a hegemony civilization called the Marathi Federation, who was speaking in council for the first time, and had a tendency to choose her words with the care of someone who does not say things casually. "The entity that built the gates is itself still present, in the same fold space substrate that contains the archived civilizations." The room was quiet. I had thought about this. I had thought about it extensively, in the fold space entry and in the months since. I had asked the archived network entities directly. The answer I received was complicated, and not entirely certain, and had the quality of something that exists at the edge of even fold space comprehension. "We do not know," I said. "The network does not know. What the archived civilizations can perceive, across their long preservation, suggests that the builders are not absent, but present, and present in a detectable way, are not the same thing. Whatever the builders are, they are old enough to be present in a way that looks like absence." "Should we be concerned about that?" the Marathi representative asked. I thought about the pattern of patterns I had seen in fold space, the enormously complex thing being assembled across billions of years, from civilizations the gates had found worth preserving. The size of it, the patience of it. "I think," I said carefully, "that we are participants in something much larger than any of us can currently see clearly, and that the appropriate response to that is not concern, but attention. The Gate Network is a very old invitation to a very large project. We have been, for most of human history, and for most of the hegemony's history, living in the invitation without reading it carefully. We have now read it more carefully. What we do next is the more interesting question." The council session continued for another 4 hours, and covered many things that were not gates, including resource allocation disputes, and transit rights negotiations, and 3 separate procedural arguments that I sat through with the patient attention of someone who has learned that the work of a large institution includes a great deal of procedural argument, and that this is not failure but function. After the session, Sorvax found me in the corridor outside the council chamber. "Admiral Vasquez," he said. "Commander Sorvax," I said. We had been on a first-name basis for about 8 months, but we both still occasionally defaulted to titles in formal settings, which was a habit neither of us had quite decided to break. "That thing you said," he said, "about the builders being present in a way that looks like absence. Yes. It reminded me of something in the Vethrani philosophical tradition," he said. "A very old idea, predating our space era, about how the oldest things in existence show themselves by the effect they have on everything around them, rather than by being visible directly, a kind of presence through implication. That is a very elegant way to say it, I said. The Vethrani wrote a great deal of philosophy before we developed space travel, he said. Some of it turns out to be about the gate network. I smiled at that. And you did not know it. We did not know it. He paused. Admiral, Claire, I want to say something that the council session is not the right place for. Go ahead. The Supreme Council sent 50 million ships through the Soul Gate because we did not know what else to do, he said. We had watched 7 civilizations disappear and we panicked. We behaved, in the diplomatic sense, very badly. We issued an ultimatum with translated language that was softer than it should have been, which was a form of manipulation, even if we believed we were protecting you. We did not tell you what we knew. We treated your civilization as something to be managed, rather than as a partner. You were frightened, I said. We were frightened, he agreed. Fear does not excuse it, but it explains it. Sorvax, I said. Your civilization sent 50 million ships to make us take a conversation seriously. My civilization responded by learning the Gate Network's language in 60 years, activating it in front of you to demonstrate parity, inviting you into our most classified research program, and then going into fold space personally to talk to the entity inside it. We are not exactly a civilization that handles things conventionally either. He considered that. No, he said. You are not. I think we are probably well matched, I said. Something in his expression shifted in the way that I had, over 14 months, learned to read, as the Vethrani equivalent of amusement, with genuine warmth behind it. That is an extremely generous interpretation of the last 14 months, he said. I prefer generous interpretations, I said. They tend to produce better outcomes. He walked with me for a while through the corridor of the station, which had the high ceilings and ambient lighting of Vethrani architectural preference, and which I had found, on my first visit, disorienting, and had now found, after 4 visits, comfortable. This is what familiarity does with things that were once strange. It does not make them less themselves. It makes you more capable of being present with them. There is a new signal, he said. I looked at him. From the edge of the galaxy, he said. The monitoring network registered it yesterday. Not the same type as the fold space events. Something different. Not from inside the network, from outside it. Outside the gate network, I said. From approximately 200,000 light-years beyond the network's outer boundary, he said. Our analysts have not characterized it. It does not match any natural phenomenon in our database. It was not present in our monitoring records before the Soul Gate exclusion demonstration. I stood still in the corridor for a moment. Before the exclusion demonstration, I thought. Before, but not before our 60 years of resonance tests. Before the demonstration that the entire hegemony fleet had witnessed, but not before the 47 controlled tests that had announced, in a very quiet but very specific way, that something in human space had learned to speak the Gate Network's language. Not the demonstration that announced us. The tests, years before, that announced we were learning. Something had been listening for a long time. Something had watched us learn. Something was now answering. Does the council know? I asked. The analysis team informed the council chair an hour ago, he said. I imagine the council chair is currently doing what council chairs do, with information they do not yet know how to characterize. Which is? Preparing a briefing for tomorrow, he said, and hoping someone in the room has useful ideas. I thought about Dr. Amara Osei, 60 years ago, running a mathematical sequence through a resonance apparatus on a whim, to see what would happen. Knocking on a door she did not know existed. I thought about the thing at the edge of the galaxy, that had been listening since before I was born, and was now, perhaps, knocking back. Sorvax, I said. Yes. We need Grace, I said, and we need Oral, and we need the full directorate briefing on what the archived civilizations know about what is outside the Gate Network. I have already requested the archived civilization records, he said. Grace Nakamura's team is being notified now. Oral is already in his office. I think he did not go to sleep last night, after the monitoring report came in. Good, I said. And Sorvax. Yes. The next time something sends us a message from 200,000 light-years away, I said, we should try to remember that whatever it has been watching us long enough to see us go from first contact with the Vethrani to releasing archived civilizations from fold space in 60 years. It knows what we are. It knows what we are capable of. And? He asked. And it chose to answer anyway, I said. That seems like a reasonable basis for a conversation. He was quiet for a moment. You are, he said, exactly as remarkable as I was afraid you would be when I first looked at your signal coming out of fold space. You were afraid I would be remarkable? I was afraid, he said, that you would be remarkable, and that it would mean the galaxy was about to become significantly more complicated. Was I wrong to be afraid? I smiled. Sorvax, I said. The galaxy became significantly more complicated the moment Amara Osei ran a mathematical sequence through a resonance apparatus 60 years ago, and the gates answered. We have just been catching up since then. I left him in the corridor and walked to the section of the station where the directorate maintained its working offices, where Grace Nakamura was already at her desk, with 3 monitors running and a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago and which she had not noticed, and where the new signal's data was already being parsed by the most extraordinary collection of minds I had ever had the privilege of working alongside. I sat down at the open console they had set up for me, because they had known, without needing to be told, that I would be here. I looked at the signal. It was not threatening. It was not warm. It was not any of the things that signals in the stories I had read growing up were described as being. It was simply a pattern, in a language that bore a strong family resemblance to the Gate Network's language, coming from a direction we had never thought to look. It was a knock. We had learned how to knock. We had learned how to answer. We had learned how to listen to what answered us. The galaxy, in the 60 years since a tired mathematician ran a sequence through a resonance array out of pure curiosity, had become something we did not have a previous word for. Not an enemy, not an ally, not a frontier to be crossed. Something more like a conversation that had been happening, in one form or another, for 4 billion years, and which had just reached a point where we could participate in it fully and honestly for the first time. I picked up a fresh stylus and opened a working document. At the top I wrote, "What does it mean to knock from outside the network?" Then I started writing notes. Outside, 200,000 light-years away, something was waiting for our answer. It had already waited long enough to know that we would find it eventually. It could wait a little longer. We were going to get this right.